So this is a little bit of an unusual presentation. It's not a normal research presentation with lots of technical modelling results or anything like that. It's a much higher level presentation on I guess an overview, a summary, a synthesis, some reflections on the economics of research into the economics of natural resource management in Australia over the last 60 years. And so the origin of this is the fact that the Australian Agricultural and Resource Economic Society is in fact 60 years old this year. So that society was formed really to reflect the growth, the initial establishment of agricultural economics as it was then in Australia. And in Canberra earlier this year we had a workshop to celebrate our 60th birthday before the conference of that society. And I was invited to provide a review of Australian and New Zealand research on the economics of natural resource management particularly. So obviously Agricultural and Resource Economic Society covers a whole lot of different topics. I was asked to focus on this particular topic, and other people were asked to provide similar presentations on other issues. And all of those different presentations have been written up and will be appearing, I think it's in the next issue of the Australian Journal of Agricultural and Resource Economics. So it's already. So I think pretty much all the papers are already online, but the actual issue is on. Oh, okay. There you go. Maxim's ahead of me. So Maxim will recognise this diagram because this is something that he produced for a complementary paper. So this isn't the main paper I'm going to talk about, but it highlights one of the points I want to make quite well. So along here I've got the year from the mid-50s to 2015, and each of these little areas represents the proportion of work in that year that was in different categories of research. So farm economics, cropping, livestock productivity, risk, forecasting, policy, trade, food markets, food security, fisheries, water, land, mining, environmental valuation, and the environment, other aspects of the environment. So the reason I wanted to put it up was just to highlight the trends in the emphasis of research in Australia by this broad group of researchers. And if you look at just the top 5 categories, which are mainly the agricultural-oriented ones, over that 60-year period, they've gone from being about a bit over 50% of the work, the publications, to being about 20%. And if you look at the bottom 5, which are sort of broadly speaking, maybe the bottom 6, the natural resource management, environmental sort of ones, they've done exactly the opposite. They've gone from being a bit under 20% to being about 50%. So we've had a really big swing in the emphasis of the research effort of this group of natural resource agricultural economists over this time period. So I was asked to speak specifically on natural resource management, and there was another group asked to speak on environmental economics, so we had to try and define what the difference was. And of course there's some overlap between the two talks. We didn't really try and be very exclusive. But I'm going to talk about research that relates to land conservation, soil conservation, water, marine resources, nature conservation, forests, and some cross-cutting issues. So that's my boundaries. And so I've excluded some things that you might have expected me to talk about. I'm not going to talk about environmental valuation, some non-market valuation. I'm not going to talk about climate change or mining or everything in agriculture other than land conservation type issues. There are separate papers on each of those in the issue that's just come out. So what did we do? How did we do this? Well, we did a couple of different things. One of the things that we did was Jimmy, one of the co-authors, I sent him off to read every paper that had been published, or at least look at them, in these 3 journals. These are the 3 main journals that our society has published over that 60-year period. There were 2 journals in the first sort of 40 years, and then over the last 20 years they were merged into this one. So the Review of Marketing and Ag Economics, the Australian Journal of Agricultural Economics, and then the Australian Journal of Agricultural and Resource Economics. So you saw the change already in emphasis, and you can see there's a change in the titles of these journals. These were just agricultural in their name at least, although not only in their content. And then because of the changing emphasis, we changed the name as well. So having looked at every single paper that had been published and tried to identify all of the ones that had what within our boundaries of what was natural resource management, we then identified every author from Australia or New Zealand who had at least 2 papers out of that. And then we went and found every other paper that they'd published in any journal in the world. Right, so that's how we sort of identified Australian research. We weren't limiting it to Australian journals, we were limiting it in New Zealand. We were limiting it to Australian and New Zealand authors. Yeah?
So you weren't looking only at natural resource management, so if there was a valuation, you didn't include
That's right, unless the paper also covered an aspect of what we were defining as NRM as well.
like policy or management.
Yeah, or related to water. So, this part of the study is limited, so the quantities of publications that I'll show you are limited to journal articles, okay? We haven't done this for books and book chapters and government reports and so on, because there isn't an easy way of getting at those, but this was a relatively nice, neatly defined. We had the advantage of having an online database that shows all the publications over the relevant time period. But when we got to the next stage, which was not just doing counts of articles, but talking about what had they discovered, what had they actually contributed, what were the key insights, then we broadened it out, and it wasn't just journal articles. We did include books and government reports and chapters and so on as well. And there was a few standout things that did only appear in that sort of publication, not in journal articles. Okay, so here's the first result, which is even more extreme than that first graph I showed you. Now, the first graph was generated by Maxim feeding all of the PDF files from all of those journal articles into a computer program and processing it, looking for patterns of words and repetition of words, and then allocating groups of papers to the particular topics. This was done in a different way. This was done by actually looking manually at each individual paper and saying, well, does this fit in our definition of NRM or not?
So that was proportions and this one counts.
This is counts and the other one was proportions.
And number of papers is increasing.
That's right. So there are many more papers of all types published in the later years than in the early years. But even so, I think that this result is probably even more extreme than Maxim's, even if we express it as a proportion, where for the 50s, 60s, 70s, up to the mid-80s, there was an average of about 1 paper per year. So really it wasn't an issue of very much focus for Australian economists. But from the mid-80s, it really starts to increase quite steadily. And in from the 2000s, the number of papers really explodes, such that about 2/3 of all the papers in this set of papers have been published since 2005. So there has been a really significant change in emphasis in the research of our discipline area. We broke all those papers down into a set of into various categories, broad groupings, and I'll break these down further in a minute, but broad groupings just to see where the main emphasis was, and these are in order as you can see. So the biggest group of papers by far was on the topic of topics related to water, and then roughly half as many papers on fisheries and agriculture, land conservation sort of stuff. So when I talk about agriculture, I'm only talking about the conservation type aspects of agriculture, not all the other business sort of oriented aspects. But about the same, and about half the amount of water. A fair number of papers on a range of cross-cutting issues that are relevant to natural resource management but not specific to any particular type of natural resource. Not very much at all on the economics of nature conservation, and not even less on the economics of forestry. There's a huge international literature on the economics of forestry, very little of it by Australians for some reason. I really don't know why that's the case.
Maybe not much forest in Australia as compared to the US.
I guess, yeah. There's a couple of asterisks here, which just to highlight that I had to make a decision about where to stick the papers on market-based instruments, conservation tenders, many of which do focus on nature conservation, but because there are methods that are broadly applicable, I put them in the cross-cutting issues section rather than the nature conservation. But we'll talk about those in more detail later on. So if you break those, we've seen this graph already in totals, if I break them down into those categories, you can get a bit of a sense of how the categories have changed over time. So in the first 30, 40 years, there was a mixture predominantly of agriculture and water, but more agriculture. But then in the last 20 years, there's been by far more research done on water. There was almost nothing, in fact there was absolutely nothing on fishing until the mid-80s, and then that's grown quite significantly. So fishing, after starting 30 years after agriculture, has actually caught up in the remaining time. And then the rest, there's little bits and pieces here and there.
Interesting to see, because in the back in the 50s, 60s, the idea of scarcity of fishing is not a big thing.
I guess that
so if economics is about the science of scarcity,
yeah.
then it'd be interesting to see about how that might correlate with either prices or whatever.
So one of the points I'm going to make is that you can trace a really strong correlation between the emphasis of the research and current policy initiatives or policy controversies or policy pressures. Not in every case, but in most cases. All right, so that's all I'm going to show you in terms of the aggregate numbers. I'm going to start breaking it down into more within those broad categories now. And I'm also going to talk about the key sort of emphases and contributions within each of those categories of water, agriculture, fisheries, and so on. So what topics have been the focus of research attention, and what have been the key insights or contributions? And I've just said that the most topics with lots of research have been topics with major policy initiatives at the time when the research was being conducted. So I'll start with water, because that's the one with the most papers. So that's a photo I took on a cotton farm in New South Wales. And that also makes the point that the majority of this work on water was not conducted in Western Australia. It's been conducted in, probably the majority would be in and around the Murray-Darling Basin in Queensland, New South Wales, Victoria, and a little bit in South Australia. And I'm going to talk, each time we get to each area I'll identify some of the key policy initiatives that have occurred, or policy developments that have occurred, that have, I think, contributed to the emphasis of the research. So lots of different policy initiatives have occurred in water over this time period, starting probably in the 80s, but really getting going in the 90s. There was a cap on water extractions from the Murray-Darling Basin, the development of water markets in the Murray-Darling Basin and later on elsewhere, the establishment of the Commonwealth Environmental Water Holder as a purchaser of water for environmental purposes on the market. And in fact, the Commonwealth Environmental Water Holder is now the biggest single holder of water entitlements in Australia. They hold more than any agricultural enterprise. The Millennium Drought in the eastern states, and then more recently, sort of at the end of that, the Murray-Darling Basin Plan have all been prominent. So within the water area, we broke the papers down into quite a few different sections, probably more than in any other broad grouping. And you can get a sense of the emphasis of the research from these are the numbers. So this is, this is a little bit rough, I guess, but it's an indication of the level of effort in these various different aspects of the economics of water. And I'll talk about a couple of the really big ones in a minute. But there's a few things there's a few minor ones: risk and variability in water supply, a little bit on urban water, fair emphasis on community issues and so on. But the really big one was water markets, and there's quite a bit of emphasis here on environmental aspects of water too, which I'll talk about. But before I do get to those, I just want to mention one particular book, which is a real landmark, which all agricultural and environmental economists educated in Australia should be aware of. And this is a book by Bruce Davidson called Australia, Wet or Dry. It was really, Bruce wrote two classic books in the 60s, this one and a thing called The Northern Myth, about development of agriculture in the northern part of Australia and the challenges and difficulties and unrealistic expectations that there were about that. And they were really ahead of their time. He was had incredible foresight and was a very powerful advocate for his sort of insights as well. but he had a lot of difficulty getting across his message. So his message from this book was really about trying to put a dampener on the enthusiasm for a never-ending development of irrigation in Australia, which at the time was enormously, enormous emphasis, enormous investment going into it. And you can see that it has happened in other countries since, and he pointed out very correctly that in a number of cases the benefits of that were much less than the costs. And I make the observation in the paper that our eventual success as a discipline in convincing the public and policymakers that Bruce was right has been a major contribution and reduced a lot of wasted investment. So I think that's a bit of a beacon, an iconic publication. But there are lots of others in this whole water area. So within the area of water markets and water rights, it's the single most emphasised area of any that I'll talk about today. And it had many contributors. You see I've highlighted Donna Brennan's name in blue there. So when I come to one of these researchers who's done work, who was based at UWA, at least did some of their work here, I'll highlight them in blue. But Donna was the only one, really, I think, of the major contributors in this area. Everyone else has really got to focus on the Murray-Darling Basin. And even Donna's work was mainly focused on the Murray-Darling Basin. So these people had to solve a lot of quite tricky problems to help us get water markets established. They had to work out how to make the markets operate logistically. They helped to define property rights for water. They helped with understanding the unbundling of property rights between land and water, which previously was sort of combined into one set of property rights, and it made it very difficult to sell water rights without selling land. And they also there's a fair bit of focus on the interaction between markets and the environment. Yeah.
So with the major contributors, are you talking about the journal only or the whole discipline?
No, the whole discipline, not just the journal. The names I put up here, they could be in any sort of publication. So, for example, Anna Heaney was working for ABARES, or ABARE, or the BAE, I think, as it was at the time. Most of her publications are ABARES publications, not journal publications. So, maybe I should just mention some of the names. So, Warren Musgrave at UNE, Quentin at ANU, Henning and Sarah at Uni of South Australia, Anna Heaney at ARES, at ABARE, as I said, Al Watson in Melbourne, Lynn Craze at La Trobe. Yeah, he's moved to Uni of South Australia, that's right. Okay, so I would argue that this area is probably the single biggest contribution of economists to NRM policy, and that it was a really difficult thing to achieve, but it was achieved, and it has had, well, a difficult thing to measure, but according to the National Water Commission, they estimated the benefits of the existence of water markets as being in the hundreds of millions of dollars per year, and probably higher than that when we were in a drought era. And the other one I want to touch on in water is the issue of environmental aspects of water, and there's three different topics here which I could group together and say there's about 80 papers. Environmental water, which means the purchase of water and allocation to environmental uses. River salinity as a specific topic, and water quality for every other reason other than salinity. And so there's basically pretty much the same group of authors as I had on the previous slide also worked on this issue of the purchase of environmental water. A smaller group, John Quiggin, David Adamson, Tom Nordblom, Jeff Connor, looked at the issue of river salinity. There's quite a lot of work on river salinity, but it struck me in looking at this collection of papers that in some respects you could argue that they'd missed the mark, because river salinity is actually an area where it's one of the few areas of salinity which you could count as a success story, or particularly in the Murray-Darling, where the actual concentration of salinity in the rivers they've stopped going up and it's even fallen a bit. But that's primarily due to engineering works. They pump out, they still do it, they pump out saline groundwater, stop it from entering the river, put it back into evaporation basins, and that's been a very successful strategy. But every one of the papers, every one of these 30 papers, not one of them looks at that. They all look at land use change in the catchments, which was one of the strategies for trying to reduce salinity. But in fact, it was a really unsuccessful strategy. Almost all of the benefits came from engineering. So that was an area where I think economists had a real blind spot about where the real action was. And then nutrient sediment pollution other than salinity. Graham Dool, who has until recently been part of the school and has now rejoined us as an adjunct, I think he's done probably the best work in this area, predominantly in New Zealand, but some work in Australia, but again in the East. Romy Greiner and some others, John Rolfe, have done good work looking at the economics of prevention of pollution in the Great Barrier Reef. And so the emphasis of this work, and actually of much of this work, has been on trying to identify optimal land use patterns and land management changes to try and achieve the best reduction in pollution at the least cost, to try and optimise the reduction for a given budget of public funding. So there have been some quite sophisticated models developed there. And Graham's work in particular has been very influential in New Zealand, where he's now working closely with the Ministry for Environment and the Ministry for Agriculture over there on how they design their policies to protect their lakes, particularly their lakes. Okay, so that's water. I probably said more about water than I'll say about any of the other topics. Agriculture, and again, just the conservation-related aspects of agriculture. And there's been a whole series of policy initiatives over this time frame related to agriculture, starting with what historically now looks like a relatively small program, the National Landcare Program in the 90s and 2000s, and then through a series of other evolving programs that used sort of similar methods, but an evolving set of methods, the Natural Heritage Trust, the National Action Plan for Salinity, Caring for Our Country, and then a new program, a recent program called National Landcare Program, which is actually rather different to what it used to be like. It's a much more sort of omnibus program with a whole range of different things in it. But I guess since about the Natural Heritage Trust, Australia's invested something of the order of $200 million a year in these programs. So they're significant. And there's been research on many different aspects of these that are relevant to these programs. Herbicide resistance is a bit different. I'll talk about that in a minute. It's actually a bit of an outlier. But these other issues, well, particularly conservation of NRM practices, environmental impacts of agriculture, organic ag, soil conservation, soil salinity, and a few other things, are all things that are core focuses of those programs. The big ones, you can see again, there's a bit of a range of emphasis. I'll talk about soil conservation and salinity, and I'll touch on herbicide resistance. So soil conservation. I'll talk about that first because it was really the area that economists talked about first. In those first years of that graph where there's just the occasional publication, most of those were about soil conservation. And the guy doing many of those was Jack Sinden from the Uni of New England. He looked at a variety of different questions. He estimated what was the damage due to soil degradation. He estimated community support for conservation measures. He looked at the influence of conservation measures on farmland values. And Tony Chisholm's paper in the early 90s was a bit of a landmark because it was the first time a president of the Agricultural and Resource Economics Society had done a presidential address that really focused on these areas, and his was largely focused on soil conservation as well. And I think that the contribution here is a bit amorphous. It's a bit sort of abstract, I suppose. That I think what these people really did was to introduce a stronger note of realism into the thinking about these policies. The early policies in particular I would class as quite idealistic and hopeful in what they could achieve, and these early economic studies helped to remind people of some of the challenges in making these policies successful, and in particular the fact that doing certain activities like land use change had high opportunity costs, or at least had opportunity costs that needed to be considered, and meant that some of the hopes for those early programs were never realised. The second one is soil salinity, which you can see is the biggest number of papers of any of these papers. So the Romy Greiner, who's now back at James Cook University, did the bulk of the early work on the economics of salinity, and all of her work was focused on one area of New South Wales, the Liverpool Plains. But in the 2000s, there was a bit of a boom in work on salinity due to funding from the Cooperative Research Centre for Salinity. And I and Ross Kingwell and a bunch of other people here at UWA and some people in the East as well, like Oscar Cacho, were involved in that research. And when I was looking at trying to identify, well, what are the key things that we contributed to the debate about salinity management in that time, I think we helped to identify, one thing we identified was the high private costs of salinity mitigation. A bit like what I mentioned with soil conservation generally, there was optimism in the design of the programs that these salinity mitigating activities would be widely adopted, but when you did the economics, many of them, not all, but many of them were very costly to adopt on a large scale. We also found that in Western Australia especially, but also in other places, the spread of benefits off the farms where these changes were occurring, the enterprises were being changed or the mitigating activities were being implemented, the spread to neighbouring farms or to neighbouring rivers or to neighbouring vegetation was much less than you would hope. There was a sort of a hydrological issue here. There's just some of this is just about the tendency of water to spread from one place to another. But there were sort of economic arguments in there as well. So the public benefits of salinity mitigation were actually much smaller than people expected them to be. And so the argument that salinity was an externality that justified, and therefore a market failure that justified government intervention, was much weaker than had been assumed when the policies were originally designed and put in place. I also, with some colleagues, did assessment of the salinity policy, especially the National Action Plan, and concluded that it had been extremely poorly designed. And I think that's a conclusion that has stood up to the test of time. Yes, Steve?
I was wondering, you might have thought at some point, or you or your colleagues, what would have been the impact of the government's salinity policy if it had been well designed?
So that's a good question. It still would have been quite challenging. Salinity, I think one of the issues with salinity specifically is it's an extremely difficult problem to mitigate, and that with the resources that were available, if they were being spent on land use change, on compensating farmers for public benefits that they generated from land use change, the opportunity cost was so large that we would have needed to focus that quite tightly, and the actual benefits that could have been generated were fairly modest. So I guess they would have been a lot bigger than they actually turned out to be, where we spent the money relatively undiscriminatingly and without recognising these things. Yeah, but they still wouldn't have been huge, I guess.
There was a lot of emphasis on mitigation.
Yeah.
What do you recommend?
I think, yeah, well, that's right. I think that adaptation was probably a more important, a more realistic response in many cases, just like with climate change, where, in reality, we're not going to stop climate change much, and so we need to put a significant emphasis on adaptation as well as on mitigation. Whereas the program, initially at least, had no emphasis on adaptation at all. It was not even mentioned in the original program documents. It came to get more emphasis over time, as people realised. An interesting observation is that salinity research, of all types, pretty much, not just economics, has pretty much ceased. And that coincides with the fact that salinity investment has pretty much ceased. When that salinity program ended, the subsequent programs have had almost no investment in salinity since about 2008, when that program ended. And the other one I'll touch on, because it's a bit of an unusual one, is herbicide resistance. So I consider herbicide resistance to be relevant to this topic because it's really about conserving something. It's about conserving the usefulness of herbicides as a resource to farmers. and it's about how you manage that over time. So it's very much like a soil conservation problem in some ways, but it's largely a private problem. There can be a public problem in terms of spread of resistant weeds between farms, but mostly it's a private problem. Most of the resistance that has occurred is because farmers have generated it for themselves. And resistance is a really big issue nationally and internationally, but what was interesting for me to observe when we put all the research together was that every bit of the Australian research on herbicide resistance had been done in Western Australia, and largely through my team. And so we did a range of different things. So that seems to me a mistake. It seems like a real lack of recognition of an important issue in other states. And what the sort of things we did was evaluate particular systems or strategies for mitigating or delaying herbicide resistance or responding to it once it occurs. We concluded that preemptive actions to try and stop the development of herbicide resistance are usually not economically beneficial to farmers. There are exceptions to that, the main exception being glyphosate in some cases. It can be worth trying to prevent glyphosate resistance for a specific set of reasons, which we won't go into now unless you ask. But we also found that once resistance does occur, the economics do strongly favour very substantial changes in farm management practices. Ben?
Was fungicide resistance also considered? Because that's probably almost as big an issue as herbicide resistance, possibly. I don't know.
I'd say historically it was bigger, but not now. There's some significant differences in the genetics between pesticide and fungicide resistance versus herbicide resistance. Herbicide resistance tends to be, getting into some technical stuff, tends to be much more about single gene resistance, and so it tends to be more an all or nothing type form of resistance, whereas the pesticide and fungicide resistance is often a much more multi-gene thing, and it does change the economics of management. Okay, that's that one. So that's all I'll talk about for agriculture. Marine resources. A couple of policy highlights. One is the establishment of maximum economic yields used to define quotas, and then the establishment of markets for individual tradable quotas in some key Australian and New Zealand fisheries. And then a relatively recent policy initiative was around marine reserves. So marine economics has really boomed in the last couple of decades, and there's a whole variety of different topics that people have researched. Nothing stands out to the extent that water markets did, but you can see that basically the equivalent markets, individual tradable quotas, has been a strong emphasis. This is a bit of a general topic, a bit of a broad topic, looking at specific fisheries management practices, but marine reserves is the other relatively big one. So let's look at ITQs and property rights for fisheries. So this has not been a major focus. There has been a bit of work in WA. Bob Lindner was involved in work in this area, particularly in the early days. But the big players have been people like Quentin Grafton and Tom Compass at ANU, and Sean Pascoe at the Uni of Tasmania, and a few others. But Australia, one of the prompts for this research was the fact that Australia was one of the first countries in the world to introduce individual tradable quotas in 1984 for bluefin tuna. And then New Zealand soon afterwards introduced them for a number of species. And this put Australia and New Zealand really ahead of much of the world in terms of relatively good fisheries management. I think these fisheries economists would probably argue that there's still a long way to go in the quality of Australia's fisheries policy, but that it is much better than fisheries policy in most other places. And so these guys have looked at a range of different issues. They've done a lot of research on the specific design and operation of individual tradable quota systems, and on dealing with a range of different complexities, such as how do you cope with the fact that they catch things like that they're not meant to catch? How do you deal with bycatch in a way that doesn't just do a whole lot of environmental damage? And the other one is marine reserves. So relatively recent development, the Australian government, the previous Australian government introduced a large new series of marine reserves, which I'll talk about in a minute. So a couple of the same people, Quentin and Tom, have done a reasonable amount of research on this over the last, pretty much over the last decade. These are, the whole area of marine reserves has been somewhat controversial and has set different interest groups into conflict. Fishers, the tourism industry and biodiversity conservation interests have all had quite different perspectives on what should happen in relation to marine reserves, with fishers typically arguing for fewer reserves and less protection, and tourism and biodiversity interests arguing for more. And so this is a map of what the Australian government did. The Labor government, they came up with this system of reserves of a variety of different levels of protection. The strongest ones being, I think, these green ones, which are like no-take areas. But unfortunately, well, if you like the idea of marine reserves, unfortunately, before these reserves were actually made into law, there was a change of government, and the new government under Tony Abbott came under pressure particularly from Queensland fisheries interests, and introduced a review of this whole system. And there's been a report which has just come out in the last couple of weeks, which proposes a whole, not complete demolition, but significant winding back of this system of marine reserves. So it's actually quite a topical issue right now. If you're interested in it, you can go and look in The Guardian. There's a lot of debate going on. All right, I'll try and get to the end quickly so we can have a bit of discussion. Some cross-cutting issues. And I think the policy highlight that stands out here is around market-based instruments, particularly reverse auctions or conservation tenders, which are my two different terms for the same thing. And the sort of famous examples, bush tender in Victoria, with a number of other examples that followed after that, and the National Environmental Stewardship Scheme. So I've bundled together a few different topics here, most of which have only had pretty small level of attention: project assessment and ranking, the commons, community issues, governance, offsets. Not a lot of emphasis from economists specifically, but a bit. But the big one by far is market-based instruments and incentives, and I'll also talk a little bit about transaction costs. So the market-based instruments, key people publishing in this area include Gary Stoneham, Steve from our group, John Rolfe, Andy Reeson, and a bunch of others. Probably Jeff Connor should probably be on that list. And then I think it's fair to argue that Australia has been a world leader, a bit like we have been with water markets, with the difference being that water markets are very well embedded in our institutional arrangements, and no one's suggesting that they should go away. Whereas bush tender, or the whole idea of these market-based instruments, has been, I guess, I wouldn't call it a roller coaster exactly, but I'd say you could argue that it's peaked. The level of interest in it has peaked. Probably peaked sometime in the late the noughties, sometime around 2010. Perhaps the high water mark being when they were used to allocate funding under the National Stewardship Scheme, which was an Australian government scheme with quite a significant level of funding. So one question you could ask is, why did it peak? What's caused it? They haven't gone away. There's still a fair degree of interest, but there's also a fair degree of resistance too to their widespread use, and groups that could be using them just choosing to ignore them. So what's going on? Well, I think there's a few parts to the explanation. One is that compared to the relatively simple approaches that environmental organisations usually use to allocate their funding to different investments, MBIs involve additional information requirements and additional processes that have costs, transaction costs, so people were resisting that. To do it well requires a significant level of expertise, which not all organisations have. I think there's a perception that the benefits may not be there, that the additional gains from doing this aren't really there compared to the approaches that organisations already use. In some cases, I think that's fair enough. I think particularly when organisations are doling out quite small amounts of money, then it's really probably not worth the transaction costs that's involved to do something like this. But I also think that in some cases there's a lack of understanding of how these tools work, and so for example, a lack of understanding that they require competition. So I've actually observed people who are trying to roll them out but actually limiting the number of people who can bid. So complete misunderstanding of what should be happening. And then I think an unreasonable level of satisfaction with the existing processes of decisions and funding allocation, which in my view are often quite weak and have lots of scope for improvement, but people may not necessarily realise that. But importantly, I think it also conflicts, this sort of approach conflicts with existing processes and cultures. And that was very much in play in the national government, in the Department of the Environment, when they made a decision to actually step away from this approach and to dismantle what they had already done in the National Stewardship Scheme. And people, relatively senior people in the organisation, overrode more junior people who were very enthusiastic about it and said, no, this doesn't fit our processes, it doesn't fit our culture, this is not the way we do business. And one of the key factors was that the system had actually put out contracts for actions over a period of 10 years. And governments almost never do that, at least in the environment sector. That most project funding is for 3 years at most, sometimes 5 if you're lucky. But you know, I would argue that what it really needs, if the sector needs anything, it needs longer commitments of funding. It was the one best thing about the whole program, and they shut it down because of it. So that's terribly disappointing. And I guess the other observation I'd have is that there's a lack of reward or requirement for organisations to actually have a very strongly outcome-oriented process, which an MBI really requires you to have. I'm going to hold you to the end, Steve, because to the question time. Last one I'll mention, and this is transaction costs. Only a relatively small number of papers, but it's worth mentioning because WA plays an above-average role in this. So Ray Challen was a PhD student in this school, supervised by Steve, and Laura McCann was formerly a lecturer in this school, and they really did quite groundbreaking work in the estimation and identification and definition of transaction costs in environmental programs. Laura's gone on now to work in America, in Missouri, still working on similar issues. Ray's a private consultant, and he's probably moved on to other issues. But the work that they did has really established Australia as one of the relatively advanced countries in terms of work on this topic. Nature conservation I can do quickly because there's not a lot of work in this area. There's some funding available under those same programs I've already mentioned. I could have, as I said, mentioned this under the topic of market-based instruments, but I've already talked about that. There is some nice economics work in this area, some done by Maxim on optimisation of restoration, spatial optimisation of restoration. But overall, I think 13 papers is a big underinvestment by economists, or by the funders of economists, in assessing the benefits and costs of nature conservation generally. But interestingly, there has been effort to try and fill that gap by non-economists. So ecologists, particularly those working in Hugh Possingham's group in UQ, have dabbled quite extensively in relatively simple but pretty useful economic analysis of the benefits and costs of nature conservation. So that's an interesting observation. Right, so in conclusion, we've seen a major increase in the emphasis given by economists to NRM issues. Some examples I've talked about, you can clearly identify that there's been strong policy influence, but others not so much. And I think overall, I think economics has been less influential than it could be and should be. Sometimes that's about lack of expertise in the NRM sector to actually understand and make use of economics information. Sometimes it reflects active opposition to economics, the whole idea of economics in some cases, by people in the sector. But I think it's beholden on economists to really do the most relevant and helpful research they can and to communicate it widely and well. And I want to finish by showing a little bit of a step sideways, a little video, that Maxim created, which I think is quite fascinating, which shows patterns of collaboration in the Australian discipline over time. It's not restricted to NRM, but I think that you'd see the same pattern within the NRM studies. So what you're going to see, though some of you have seen this already, but what you're going to see is a series of, each year there's going to be dots on the screen showing where the authors of a particular paper were located, or where they worked, and where there's co-authorship between different organisations or different places, there'll be a line between them. And the pattern that emerges over time is quite amazing. So keep an eye on the year in the middle, right? 1957, 60, moves quite quickly, 61, 62. So the huge majority of research published in the Australian journals, this is, in the early years, was done in Australia. Not much collaboration, the occasional bit, but most of it was people working within their own organisations or with themselves. We're up to 78, 79, 80. And so you can see most of the work at this stage is in the eastern states. From the 90s, the WA starts to grow quite significantly. You can see a lot more work going on in Perth. In some years we're the biggest dot. 2000. And the growth of collaboration really starts to take off. And then it just explodes. And that's the whole lot.